So good morning, everybody. I'd like to first off by acknowledging that we're on the traditional lands of the Algonquin people and welcome you as we recognize the third anniversary of the National Day of Reconciliation. My name is Laura Arndt. I am the Secretariat lead at the Survivors Secretariat based at Six Nations of the Grand River. We are a not-for-profit organization that was established in 2021. Our focus is to uncover, document, and share the truth about what happened at the Mohawk Institute during its 140 years of operation. What we have been able to identify in our work is the names of 5,900 children who attended the mush hole. We've been able to conduct research on about 14.5 acres of lands associated with 607 acres that we're investigating. We have expanded the number of impacted communities from 22 that were identified by the NCTR to now 60 First Nations communities across Canada and the James Bay and Hudson's Bay region. And as we continue to do our work, it has become increasingly important to us to ensure that as we do our work, that there is sustainable funding in place to ensure that the work can be completed and we can say the name of every child who attended the Mohawk Institute as part of our work to uncover those who are still missing and in unmarked burials. So I want to start with just letting you know that in 2021, Canada announced funding to support approximately 144 First Nations communities to begin the work into unmarked burials and missing children's investigations. Over the last 3 years, this funding has become essential to our ability to get the truth told. Then we were to learn this past July in a teleconference with Canada that funding was being reduced to $91 million over 2 years. During that teleconference, all mics were muted, and so we got to listen to Canada make the announcement. There was no information provided about protocols, guidelines, application processes. Up until that day, we were of an understanding that communities would have access up to $3 million per year over the next 3 years to fund investigative work across Canada. At that press conference, we were informed that ceiling would be dropped to $500,000, and after that meeting began the work. And that work was mobilizing the 147 Indigenous entities and organizations across this country who were leading this work. And to do that, we started with a rally here on July 22nd. We met with the minister on August 1st, and then on August 16th, we were informed by Canada that they were increasing the ceiling back to $3 million, but they were not changing the base level of funding. So while you could get $3 million, it was still only $47 million that was available this year. Because of that announcement, Canada essentially was informing us that communities were going to be pitted against each other to try and access a limited pool of funding that was available across the country. 2 days after that, we hosted a national unmarked burial conversation in Thunder Bay, Ontario. We brought people together from BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, and Ontario, with survivors talking at their tables about what this meant for them with the impact of the cuts. And we brought the experts who have been helping us in this work to talk about, from a financial standpoint, what that would mean for the level of investigative work we'd be able to do on the ground. So as we do our work, I want to start with talking to you just a little bit about our frustrations, anger, and the devastating impact of the cuts, given that just over a year ago, the Prime Minister of this country, Canada, made a statement that said, "As communities continue searching for the children who never came home, the Government of Canada will be there every step of the way. We were going to provide them with the resources they need to fully uncover the truth of what happened at residential schools, honor the children who did not return, and support communities as they continue their healing journeys." So as we do our work, there's a contradictory there, because is that work attached to $47 million, or sorry, $45.5 million, or is that work attached to a promise to get the truth told? Because the two don't reconcile with each other. We're trying to uncover a history that's 150 years old, and the limited funding we've been provided in 3 years, it's not doable. There are hundreds of millions of dollars of work that need to be done, and that's just a start to try and cover the truth of what happened in all of these schools, 139 in fact. So as we do our work, we continue to press Canada to restore funding. We continue to press the importance of the research work that's needed, both in archival work to uncover records and documents so we can find out who the children were, and it's critically important to continue to do the work associated with archaeology so that we can ensure that as we do this work, it coincides with trying to find those children who were not brought home. It means that communities, as we do this work, have to take pause, because with no funding since April 1st of this year, many have had to shutter their doors, many of them had to stop their work, and many like us have had to reconfigure everything we're doing to try and keep our doors open and our lights on as we fight Canada for the funding we need. And so today we're releasing a report that captures the growing anger and frustration of survivors, Indigenous leaders, and experts over Canada's broken promises. And we say to the Prime Minister, we've had enough. Promises only matter when you keep them, so keep your promise. Do it for the communities, do it for this country, so that they may know what real reconciliation looks like. And most importantly, do it for the survivors who lived through this nightmare and who for 60, 70, and sometimes 80 years have fought for the truth to be told about those who didn't come home. It's time for them to have to stop fighting and for Canada to step into its responsibility. So as you have in front of you, we have a list of recommendations that we are pressing Canada to implement immediately. The first is for Canada to truly work towards truth and reconciliation. And we ask that in doing that, that they give survivors access to their own records, including all 23 million documents identified but not released to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, and all RCMP records related to missing children and unmarked burials associated with the Mohawk Institute and all Indian residential schools. That Canada provide robust, stable, long-term funding for investigations into missing children and unmarked burials. That communities be able to self-determine the type of aid and required supports to lead their investigations. That Canada honor the promise of reconciliation based on truth by committing formally to a complete account of the Indian residential school experience. And that Canada ensure funding support for memorialization and public commemoration remain a central part of this work. And finally, we ask that Canada include funding support for the creation of spaces for sharing, learning, and healing. I'd like to now pass the microphone over to Roberta.
I'm Roberta Hill. I'm a Mohawk from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I was a 6-year-old child when I went into the Mohawk Institute in 1957, and I left in 1961, but I went through the 60 scoop into foster care until 1960, I believe it was 69 when I graduated from there. But today, I remember a lot of those times at the Mohawk Institute. When I first got there, and I can say most of us kids did not know what the Institute was. I didn't even know that name, residential school. We were just there. Most kids say, why was I there? You know, so even when I moved out of there, I still didn't know what that school was. And if they were there to protect us, they certainly didn't, because this is one of the, like probably all of the residential schools, very horrific, very damaging, harmful, abusive institutions that were supposed to be institutions of care. That's what we were told, our parents were told, that we'd look after you, you'd get a good education. That's not what happened. That really wasn't, and that's not the agenda. The agenda was never to do that for us. It was to assimilate. And in order to do that, they had to take the kids away from the community, away from even the Federal Indian Day schools on reserve weren't doing the job that they expected. And that was to assimilate and turn us into good Christian kids. And so today, when I hear of the funding cuts and how long I have been researching and trying to get to the truth, I go through a lot of records, and there, in those archives, it tells you a story. And so when Canada says, I'm sorry, what I want to know is, what are you sorry for? You tell the rest of Canada why you're sorry, because I don't see where they're sorry at all. Because if you're going to cut funding, we're right back where we were. More lies, more promises that can be broken. You know, so I'll give you an example what's in the archives that I find when I say they never cared. I see one article of one of the documents that says there's a child from Six Nations, a Six Nations boy. He's very sick. We need to send him home. Like, why would you send this little sick child home? Why not to a hospital? So to me, that's part of this, you know, when you're investigating where the children are, what happened to them, you look at some of those things and say, they weren't there to protect us as children, or they would have done better than that. They would have made sure that we had the proper care. But because we always were Indigenous children, we have a registry number assigned to us, we're a number. We're a dollar figure to them. And the less that they have to spend on us, then the better they are. You know, so that's the way I see it operating. But there's so many archives, so many departments that are involved in this, that it is going to take time. And to cut funding now is just absolutely ridiculous, and it just makes me angry and very frustrated over this. Because I can see in there, I see what things are happening in those archives. And so let's open it up. Let's have all of those millions that are still promised. There's millions of documents yet to come. So maybe it's a waiting game for them. They're waiting for us poor old residential school people to die. Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Not yet. Not that I know of. So I said, I'll live as long as I can because I want answers and I want the truth. There is no reconciliation. Absolutely none. If you're going to lie to us and do this to us. None. Because reconciliation means that this other party will understand. They have to be a party to this and understand why we're reconciling. And I know I talk to a lot of Canadian people, and they're shocked. It really bothers them that this could happen in Canada. And why didn't we know? It's because of the ugly history and what was done to children. There was a target on the backs of all Indigenous children in this country. That there was. And so that's where I am today, is like, if I'm upset, I have a darn good reason why I'm upset, because there's too many lies being told, you know? And if they think that cutting money is saving, you know, cutting the funding, saving money, that's a financial part. I think what people need to understand is the price we paid as children, how we were abused physically, sexually, all the rest of it, any kind of abuse, it was there. So we paid a heavy price, but here we are today, standing up still, asking to walk with us, but in honesty, in truth. And that's the only way I'm going to reconcile, is when the government can honor those commitments. And that's all I have to say.
So while Roberta and I talk a little bit about the research, media has had an inordinate focus on ground search and the work being done about ground search. What we want to say to you is both are critically important. We need the records and the documents to shape and inform what we're doing about the ground search efforts within programs across the country. So we've asked Dr. Scott Hamilton to join us today to talk a little bit about ground search efforts associated with these activities with unmarked burials of missing children.
My name's Scott Hamilton. I'm an archaeologist on faculty at Lakehead University. And I've been involved in the residential schools investigations since the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when they asked me to review the records that were available at that time and try and document where the burial places were with the schools across the country. And I was immediately struck with the information void that confronted the investigations of that time, and that void continues into the present. As we've moved into the post-2021 time, when funding became available to initiate this work, it triggered a very complex process for Indigenous communities across the country. Some had to make decisions whether they were prepared to take on the heavy burden of addressing the school within their traditional territory. And if so, how to identify and reach out to communities that were affected, where those other communities' children disappeared into that particular school. How to reach consensus within that group of affected communities about what they wanted to see happen. And this takes time. It takes a great deal of time because the communities first had to think through carefully what was possible, what were the methodologies, what methodologies might work, how to mesh a number of complex methods in order to come closer to addressing the information void problem. And probably the most important sources of information reside in the heads of the survivors. Their childhood memories need to be collected, but this is quite complicated because these are very traumatic experiences, very traumatic memories that have been suppressed for a very long time. It dredges up a lot of pain and grief and anger. And one needs to have protections in place to protect those people as they were being re-traumatized by talking about their experiences. There are written documents scattered almost literally throughout Canada, probably Europe to a very large degree. And many of these records aren't accessioned. They're not part of the federal records that are currently held by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And there are many millions of records that have been identified, but no one has looked at yet. They're not accessioned, they're not organized. So we've got this vast store of information that might be useful, might be accessible. Then there are the church records. All of this information, coupled with the memories of survivors, becomes the foundations of information about what was the nature of the operation, what was the nature of the school, how was it configured, how many children, what were their names, where did they come from, how many got to go home, how many disappeared, how many do we know died, and then there's the question of where are they buried. And much of the focus has been on that last question and the focus on technology to address that question of where are they buried. Well, we can't answer or even begin thinking about that until all of that other preliminary work is addressed. We need to identify the areas of high probability in order to focus this very complex, very expensive, and very technically demanding work of doing non-invasive investigations. And throughout this whole process, this is the need to constantly be integrating the information and evaluating the information, addressing how much we know, do gap analysis of the bits we don't still know anything about, look for contradictory information and try and track down why it's contradictory in order to narrow the search areas down as much as we can in order to be more effective in those operations. This is going to take a very long time because of the many complex confounding issues. Canada is a very large country. Schools are scattered across them. All of these schools are in different biogeographic regions, different soil conditions, different histories of redevelopment, different vegetation, different climates. All of these complexities require that each community, each investigation, develop a tailored method for conducting their investigations. This is not something that can be done hurriedly, or you end up with more troubles than you solve. And I think I'll stop there.
So before we open it up for questions, we also want to let people know that starting today, the Secretariat and organizations across the country are beginning a social media campaign, I Stand With Survivors. And the campaign is focused on standing with survivors to ensure that Canada provides the resources needed and proceeds with action on the 5 recommendations. So as we work together, while we as a small group are here, we represent more than 125 people who attended the gathering in August, organizations across the country that are encompassing of First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit people, and so this is a national Indigenous issue that we're raising today, and the report reflects their voices. So we'd like to open up the room for questions now.
We will now go to questions. One question, one follow-up. Please identify with your name and affiliation. We'll start in the room and then go to Zoom. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions. Une question et une suivi. On va commencer d'abord dans la salle, puis nous passerons à Zoom. Identifiez avec votre nom et affiliation, s'il vous plaît.
Do I take the mic? No. Okay. Thanks for the testimony. This question is for Laura. Do you have any examples of projects that must have been stopped or wouldn't be able to be started because of the cuts?
So I can give you 3 examples that we're aware of. In Ontario, I'll focus because that's where we know. I can tell you that communities like Akwesasne had their funding significantly reduced under the new funding formula. I can let you know that my understanding is Anishinaabe Aski Nation, who was working on behalf of organizations in their area, have experienced similarly drastic cuts. Anishinaabe Nation also has had extensive cuts. For the Survivors Secretariat, under the original announcement, we would have went from 10.2 million over 3 years to 1.5 million. And the devastation of that is unimaginable, but now the fact that we would have to compete to sustain the same funding levels we have is just the beginning, and we've heard the same messaging across the country. So we encourage media sources in each region to please reach out to the entities doing the work, and they can speak specifically to their information.
Thank you. And for Mr. Hamilton, in the report it is stated that because of the cuts, you wouldn't be able to do what are called invasive ground research. What does that mean for finding of new graves? And is it the kind of technique that was used in Kamloops, for example?
During the gathering in late August to discuss the consequences and implications, I was asked to talk about how, the standard methodologies were evolving and developing, and what was the sequence of steps and stages that were starting to coalesce and appear in many investigations across the country. And I was asked to take a look at that larger process and address what had to be thrown away, what was the most important, what had to be funded, and what had to be thrown away in order to protect those core activities. And my conclusion, as somebody who does this kind of thing, was that the critically most important thing was a combination of restoration of funding to support wellness, restoration of funding to collect information from survivors, continuation of the written archive search, and mothball all ground search, all geophysics, all investigations on sites, because it was too long-term, too expensive, and it was going to burn through whatever money the communities had. So as a process of retrenching down to hold on to core activities that must be undertaken, essentially told them to fire me because I am now superfluous. You need to focus on your core activities.
Can I just add to the Scott's feedback? The point has become moot. Canada has said there is no funding can be used for invasive ground search, and that was confirmed to me by Patrick Belay from CERNAC a week and a half ago. We asked him specifically, will you be reinstituting the abilities of communities to be self-determining around invasive ground search? And we were told no.
You're asking, so my question is for Laura, for you. You're asking for more money from the federal government. Do you have an idea of how much would be needed in order, or how do we calculate this amount? Or?
So I think the first thing is no search like this has ever happened in Canada before. So to put a dollar figure to it is impossible. I think the reality is what we're asking for is long-term sustainable resources to ensure that the work gets done. And I think the reality is there are two ground points that I think are critically important. Ground search and geophysics are saying it's going to take at least 15 to 20 years for the technologies to catch up. Records and documents, 23 million documents still sit in the hands of the federal government. They have not been released. Those records were promised a year ago. It took us 2.5 years to get through the 10,000 documents that Canada said they had. So we need the timeline, I would say, until every record has been searched, until the technology is able to answer the questions that need to be answered. And I think the reality is it shouldn't be an initiative. This should be a sustainable part of the work of Canada's promise on the calls to action 71 to 76.
So, in order to, I guess, make sure it's sustainable and we have enough money every year, are you asking the government to sit with you like every year to see, okay, what's the situation for next year? Because they have a budget every year, and
so for me,
so what should be the process?
I think the process has to be, I think when we talk about education in this country and when we talk about other items, there is a budget that's assigned and the work gets done. And that's what we're saying. This work has to be a budget commitment by Canada. And I don't think I'm sitting here on the National Day of Reconciliation begging for funding from a country that announced they're cutting our funding in August, and who then, when we met with the minister on the 1st of August, said, we'll talk to you the first week of September. We shouldn't be held over a barrel in the National Month of Reconciliation begging for funding for a promise that this Prime Minister made. We should be sitting here saying, I'm proud to be part of this country because we continue to do the work that needs to be done to have the truth told. Instead, I sit here saying, as people wear orange shirts today, we're not, because reconciliation isn't happening when truth isn't being told.
Laura, I'm Olivia Stepanovich with CBC News. Something that the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, Gary Ndinda-Sangari, told us this morning. We interviewed him. And in his view, he says that this is what he said, that the funding for this work was never cut. He says that there was a cap on the funding, and that cap's now been removed, and that communities can now apply until November 15th for $3 million each. How do you respond to that?
So, and this is what I said to the minister himself. It's a shell game that's being played with words. Because how do you go from 216.5 million to 91 and say it's not a cut? And while people will say it was never a line item promise, what we would say is if this wasn't going to continue, why did you wait until 9 months into the funding year to tell people that the funding level was being reduced, when just as recently as March of this year, communities were being told they could apply for up to $3 million per year for each of the next 3 years. So it is a funding cut. It's a reduction in funding. But he will say it isn't because he was saying it was time-limited funding when it was first announced 3 years ago. 3 years we were told to get yourself off the ground, do the work that you need to do so that you're ready to apply for the next round of funding. The 2024 budget in April proposed $91 million. Our understanding was in addition to the 216.5 that was already in place. And the fact is we thought that that was logical because we were aware that between 70 and 78 new initiatives were waiting to put an application in for funding. So we assumed at the very least funding would be maintained at the level it was for communities who had agreements, but the 91 million would support those new applications. So I think the minister uses words in a way that say one thing to the public, but say a very different thing to people who are leading these investigations. Is it truth? Is it not truth? It depends on the perspective you stand from. But for Indigenous people, it's not a truth because the funding was cut. And it's a broken promise because we had a Prime Minister who a year ago said that he was going to stand with us until this work was completed.
Talk about, Laura, how communities are fighting over a small pool of money. How do you think that can be prevented in the future? Does there need to be some sort of, another commission or something like that dedicated to this so that all communities get equal resources?
My dilemma is when you put money into commissions, it doesn't put money into the people who need to get the work done. Survivors have a very limited timeline left. Roberta and Lonnie. Lonnie, how old are you?
87.
87. I sit with survivors who are 93. How long does it take for a commission? Somebody's got to propose it, somebody's got to approve it, then they got to appoint people. How many more survivors will die before that happens? And it's Roberta, it's Lonnie, it's people across the country, and it's people who include our own families, my mother and the remaining family I have. Commissions don't get the work done. Communities want to bring the children home. They don't know what happened to them. They want them to be brought home. And those children have rights. Even the dead and deceased have human rights. And their human rights need to be honored so that we can find out who they are and remember them to community by doing the ceremonies of grief, of loss, of condolence. And then what we need to do is we need to bring the records home so we can bring those memories back into the community's history so we can remember them by remembering them into our individual histories. That's what survivors want, and they want to see it in their lifetime. And if we keep going at the pace that's going now, it's not going to happen. And that's Canada's failure.
David Aiken from Global News. Good morning. Thank you for being here today. Robert, I have a question for you, and maybe Laura, you might have something as well. This government's often criticized for being strong on symbols, less so on substance. That said, this is the 4th National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. As a survivor, is it making a difference, a symbol like this, on this issue, on other issues? Can you just give us your thoughts on
What do you
whether
mean,
this
this
day is-
symbol? What do you mean?
Well, it's as a symbol in the sense that it's a day where we're all reflecting on, acknowledging. When I say we, I'm a non-Indigenous person, so I'm here to learn and understand. So does that help as a survivor that we have this day, that the government did this? Is that a useful thing in your view?
Yeah, I always think that's useful, and that's what I keep hoping for, is that we can all work together. We're never going to heal unless we can understand what happened. And that's part of that reconciliation. You need to learn to, walk together, learn together, and we have to come to peace with this. And so these gatherings help because more and more people are beginning to understand what residential schools were all about. And so when they're learning, that's Canada, like Canada's population is learning. We're always going to have the naysayers who say it never happened. Maybe one day they'll understand the truth. But I think as long as we're speaking the truth, that we can get to some kind of reconciliation. It's going to take a long time, probably, and when I have, my hope is that it will be done in my lifetime, but if not, it's going to be my grandchildren, my grandchildren's time, and it shouldn't have to take that long. And so I think the more we can work together, the quicker we're going to go through this and resolve these issues. The past is the past. We can't undo it. But I want people to understand that the horrific conditions that children were put in order for the government to move forward in whatever agenda they had. So I welcome them. Bring the Prime Minister out here. That would be good. That's a good step. All the politicians and people one of the things that I see in the records, Indian Affairs was a big part of our life, that department. So Indian Affairs, we always knew about Indian Affairs. We always knew about the RCMP, why the RCMP are picking up children when they're they're in charge of criminal activities. We weren't criminals. But you see, it's all these other agencies. There's tons of other agencies that had some kind of hand in how we got there. But who was there to protect us? And so I want Canada to understand that we didn't do this alone, but that doesn't mean that we can't heal together. Because I think Canada's hurting too. It puts a dark image on Canada having this history. That's not good. Not good for Canada. So yeah, I think we'll get there if we keep gathering and doing what we're doing today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amy from the Canadian Press. My question is for you, Roberta. NDP MP Leah Gazan introduced in the House of Commons last week a bill that seeks to criminalize residential school denialism. It's a private member's bill, so it has a very small chance of actually becoming law, but do you think that all of the parties should support it?
Absolutely. Like, for people, when I think of denialism, what are you denying? You know? What are they? They need to come forward and say, oh, I don't believe in residential schools because of these reasons. Anybody can say never happened, but why are you saying it? So I'd like them to come forward face to face with us survivors who went through all this. We'll tell you, it's a reality. It was a reality for all of us. So denialism, it's alive. It probably always will be, but I think it's a good step forward. I really do.
And my next question is for Dr. Hamilton.
Can I just add
Oh, sorry,
a
yes.
response if
Yes.
it's possible? The other thing I want to add is the funding reductions, as significant as they are, doesn't get the truth out, which in fact advances the denialist argument. Because the argument will become, you see, there was no truth to what they were saying, that's why they've cut the funding. So then the question is, if we have a private member's bill, I would hope Canada would see that as the reason to say we need to reestablish the funding, because not to puts this government in the very stead of saying it's part of a denialist framework.
That kind of leads into my next question for Dr. Hamilton. As the grounds are searched and records are coming to light, and as more stories are coming out, what do you think, or what do you hope the average Canadian keeps in mind as they're hearing all of these stories?
An important part of what Robbie spoke about was the need for all of Canada to unflinchingly face our grim history. And an important part of that is acknowledging harm, acknowledging wrong. If we choose to gloss over, if we choose to ignore, if we continue to live in a never land, that these terrible things didn't happen, or they might not have been as bad as what was said, we're kind of choosing to close our eyes and hum a song so we don't have to bear witness to what happened, to confront the fact that terrible things were done in the name of our nation. And an important part of Canadian legacy is to grapple with those dark, painful facts and try and heal from them, try and seek reconciliation. But one doesn't get reconciliation without acknowledgement of those painful truths.
Fraser Neum from AP10 News. I'm curious about this meeting that I assume you could apply for fund. It was never a line item in the budget, so it wasn't. We didn't know about it in the budget for sure. And I'm really curious about how the lead up to this meeting and when it was and how it all came about that you were informed that you would be dealing with reduced funding.
So it's interesting. So starting in January, February, community started asking across the country what's going on with the funding, because we weren't hearing anything. And we were told the $3 million ceiling. Then we went into what was called radio silence. Not one agreements officer in the country was responding to emails or phone calls around the status of their applications. That continued until, probably for most, until July when the meeting happened. We were fortunate because we came here and met with the Regional Director General in April to push back against that rumored $3 million cap. So we at least had met with them, and the announcement we got is we can't say anything because the budget's coming down in April. When the budget came down in April, we started the phone calls again, not just the Secretariat, organizations across the country. Nobody returned our calls, nobody returned to our emails. I received a call on the day before the July meeting with all entities. So I got a phone call from Canada asking to meet, where I was informed that the ceiling was going to be $500,000. That in fact it wasn't a $216.5 million budget, it was a $91 million budget. So when we met, it was a 30-minute meeting. We and one other entity were contacted for those conversations, and no guidelines, no protocols, nothing. So that afternoon we were already working with a media outlet on another article about the issues around the funding. So we called them and let them know what the decision was, that Canada was reducing the funding significantly. That outlet released that information that evening, and it must have hit Canada first thing the next morning, because at 9 o'clock on the Thursday morning, Canada sent a mass email to every entity in the country for a 1 p.m. meeting for 30 minutes. At the time of that, we logged into the Zoom. All of our mics were muted. They gave us the message. If we had questions, they could only be asked in the chat. And at the conclusion, we were told this is it, $500,000. The application process would be going up soon, the new guidelines would be going up soon, and they ended the call. Like, there was no preparatory information, there was no emails from agreements officers across the country. It was, you know, as they say, a command performance. Show up for the Zoom, and we did, and that's what we got. And after the 30 minutes, they said that our agreements officers would be in touch with us in the upcoming weeks, that the funding portal would be open until November, and they expected the funding would flow in the early new year, which meant we would be looking at a full 3/4 of the financial year being passed before we would see $1 for the missing children and unmarked burials activities that are happening across the country. And still today, that's still true. The funding portal doesn't close until November. And here's the funny thing. The funding portal for this year closes in November. The funding portal for next year closes in October. So I will put an application in for next year before I've even heard a decision on this year's funding. And that's for everybody across the country. And communication since then has been sparse. We have been writing the critics, we've been writing the minister's office, we've written to the Prime Minister, and we've been doing it with the support of organizations across the country. And that gathering report you have, that report and that gathering happened in a 2-month window. That's how fast we've moved as organizations across the country. In 4 weeks, we organized the event, and in another 4 weeks, we completed a report. And that's how fast we've acted, in lieu of the fact that we have not seen a decision or an announcement from Canada.
Now, the other question I had is the government hired the International Commission on Missing Persons. There was quite a bit of fanfare about that they were going to meet with communities, and they had expertise in this area. I understand that contract has not been renewed, and also, of course, there's special interlocutor Kimberly Murray as well. Have you had any meetings with either, or has any of this been helpful in terms of communications?
I think it's all been helpful in communications. I think the ICMP report spoke clearly about sustainability of the work, that work needs to be done, and sustainable resources need to be done. Special Interlocutor's interim report and her report that's going to be released at the end of this month have said similarly. She's spoken to media about the impacts of this cut and what it does for broken promises to survivors. In addition to that, the Senate released its report on missing children, missing records, and their document similarly says that there needs to be sustainable funding. Just recently, the UN resolution on the rights of the dead. Dr. Bev Jacobs, if you want to talk a little bit about that report.
Sure. Well, there's two UN special rapporteurs that have done studies on the rights of the dead, and that it is an obligation by the state to provide the resources in order to recognize the rights and the issues that we're dealing with specifically in identification and memorials.
Another question, if possible. Sorry.
Sorry, maybe just one for Laura. You mentioned, this reducing of funding is putting communities against each other. Do we see that right now, or is this something we're expecting when they're asking for money and all this?
So it's interesting. We're not seeing it right now. And there's this beautiful phrase that Eric Large from Alberta created. He was with the Survivors Secretariat last year in an event. And he said, I like being in 6 nations, but we're creating a new nation. It's called the Survivor Nation. And I think the one thing that is very different around the issues playing out right now is that all of us who are leading organizations doing this work are united. We're not going to take funding if we're going to put another community at disadvantage, because this is about our survivors. This is about our family members. This is about our communities and healing. So that's why we've created the report, is that Canada needs to make sure that the resources accessed are equitable. This is not political. This is nothing more than survivors deserve the truth in their lifetimes. And we're, as organizations, working very hard to try and apply pressure so that we don't allow ourselves to be pulled into taking the burden of what Canada refuses to do, and that is get the work done and get it done in the way it needs to be done.
Sorry, one more question. You're all standing up here saying that this is important. It needs to be, like, records need to be searched, grounds need to be searched. In 2021, after Kamloops, there was an incredible amount of media attention. There was outcry from the Canadian public that this was a horrible stain on the legacy of Canada. Do you feel that because that attention and the outcry from Canadians has somewhat died down, that the government is following suit with, like, the priorities of the Canadian public? Like, what is the responsibility for Canadians to support you?
So I use the phrase all people in Canada, because not everybody in this country is a Canadian. So I think all people in Canada have a responsibility. And what I often say to people is you have a responsibility because no matter where you were born and no matter where you came from, if somebody came to your house one day and took your children, they physically abused them, they conducted experiments on them, they sexually abused them, they conducted malnutrition examples on them, do you think the country would owe you the truth of what happened because your child never came home? I think it's unfair to say that Indigenous people are only a priority when the spectacle of media is cast our way. The fact is, Indigenous people welcomed every nation to this country. We are the original peoples. We welcome settlers, we help them survive, and over time the relationship shifted and we lost so much. And what has happened through the Indian residential school system was the stripping away of our humanity and stripping away of our personhood. And it isn't about the loss of Canada paying attention to us. It's the fact that Canada's using that moment to quietly shift the ground politically against us. And the problem is that nobody will say in the room, Canada and the religious orders operated these entities, these Indian residential schools. Why should we have to beg money from the very entities that conducted this atrocity? They should be paying this as part of their commitment to reconciliation. And I think that's the critical part. It isn't about because Canadians didn't show up. I don't expect Canadians to show up and people in Canada to show up every day because they don't know this history. And the announcement in 2021 broke our hearts. I sat in the house with my mom who heard that announcement, and I watched the trauma on her face, and I watched it reignited. Unless it's part of your family history, it's just another sad story. But when it's your family's history, it's a battle cry. And that's what survivors are doing. They're the warriors in this. They've been warriors in this their entire lives. And it's time for Canada to say, rest. Let us take on the burden of responsibility because it is our burden. And that's our burden of reconciliation.